Sometimes in life, you meet people who initially seem unremarkable. They seem like they probably don't have too much going on in their life outside their normal day-to-day work and family life, and that's fine. The point is, though, that once you talk to them a bit more, you find out fascinating things like the fact that they once raced donkeys across Mongolia, or they know how to get out of a helicopter correctly underwater. Maybe they were once the drummer for a major touring rock band. All of that was hiding under the surface of a seemingly ordinary person. The linear Tube Audio Velo headphone amp and preamp is a little bit like those people. On the outside, it's a beautiful but basic looking amp. It's all black with brass accents. It has 4 tubes sticking out of the top, a power button, an input select button, a volume knob, and a 6.3mm headphone socket. Nothing remarkable in any of this. On the back, there are 3 sets of RCA inputs, which is nice. And there's 2 pairs of RCA pre-outs, which is also nice. But again, it's not remarkable. Finally, there's a switch to choose whether you're going to run 6 SN7 or 12 SN7 tubes in the power sockets of the Velo. And then there's a power input socket for the external power brick, or if you want to spend an extra $600, the external linear power supply. I haven't got the power supply here, so I can't speak to how that changes the sound. Those last 2 features with the tube selection switch and the options for power supply are kind of interesting, but it didn't really move the needle for me when I set up the Velo. Before we go any further though, let me introduce the unassuming linear Tube Audio Velo properly. This is Linear Tube Audio's latest pure headphone amp and preamp, and it comes in with a price tag of $2,100 or $2,700 with the linear power supply. It's been deliberately designed in a style that's reminiscent of old tube amps, and that means it's quite simple, classy, and understated. In many ways, it's also very similar to those old tube amps on the inside, but in other ways, not so much. You see, linear tube audio or LTA amps all use the same micro zOTL or zOTL technology that was originally pioneered by a man called David Burning. Linear Tube Audio have licensed that design from David Burning, but they make their own products. These designs are output transformerless or OTL, like many other tube amps, both cheap and expensive. But where the linear tube audio amps are different from traditional OTL amps is they use fancy things like carrier frequencies and impedance converters to make them a little bit more like transformer coupled amps. The output transformers used in various other tube amps have some wonderful benefits in the sense that they allow tubes to better couple with a wider range of impedance headphones and or speakers. And that means that with a transformer coupled amp, you can plug in a pair of 16 ohm planar magnetic headphones if you want to. Unfortunately, output transformers also have some problems, and one of them results in what sounds like a painful condition called transformer core hysteresis. Before you rush off to see your doctor and find out if you've got that, all you actually need to know is that transformer core hysteresis is a form of distortion created by the way the cores or the windings within the transformer interact. It produces distortion, which leads to coloration, and it leads to a sound that's not as natural, transparent, and fluid as an OTL amp can be. If you'd like a more in-depth description of the challenges of output transformers, I'll put a link in the description down below where you can click through and find out more on the Linear Tube Audio website. Coming back around to the various tube amp topologies though, and in my experience, there are some great sounding OTL amps and there are some great sounding transformer coupled amps. So nothing here is to say that any particular topology is bad, but the idea of the zOTL amplifiers from Linear Tube Audio is that they actually give you the benefits of both styles, both OTL and transformer coupled, and they do it with no compromises. How often do we get that? And so theoretically, what you're getting with a zOTL amp is a tube amp that is a pure tube amp. It's not a hybrid, it's all about tubes, but it's a tube amp that's going to work with headphones of any impedance. And so that makes it like a transformer coupled amp, but it's got the fluidity, the transparency, and a very natural sound that I've found really only OTL amps can deliver. Of course, all of this is well and good on paper, but we need to talk about how the Velo actually sounds. Is the Velo better than its price, as good as its price, not up to its price? And how does it compare to similarly priced competition? You see, some products look good, some products sound good, some products look like they should sound good, and then some products sound as good as they look. That's the Velo. This thing sounds wonderful. It's smooth, resolving, engaging, and enjoyable. It doesn't play any tricks with the music, it's overall a transparent sounding amp, and yet it makes everything sound good. It produces a relatively intimate soundstage that's not particularly wide, but it has a good sense of depth and layering, and excellent sense of separation and space around the sounds within that soundstage. There's good extension in both the bass and the treble, and a very even-handed delivery of all frequencies. As I said, it does nothing to colour or enhance the sound in any way, but it's wonderfully enjoyable thanks to the inherent qualities and characteristics of a good set of tubes running in an OTL, or in this case a zOTL circuit. It also plays very happily with all different headphones, with a low impedance, high impedance, dynamic driver, planar magnetic, or even AMT like the Headphone 2, which happens to be a wonderful pairing with the Velo. In fact, the only headphones that the Velo won't play particularly well with are the very difficult to drive headphones like Tungsten, Susvara, and Abyss 1266. Although at a pinch, you maybe could drive the Susvara and 1266 if you wanted to, I just don't think you're going to get the best out of them with the Velo. But everything else, no problems, it's going to sound fantastic. The Velo isn't a particularly powerful or gainy amplifier, and being single-ended with RCA inputs only, it can only accept the 2 to 3 volt outputs from most DACs. That's as opposed to the 4 to 5 volts that you can get from XLR outputs. That means that the Velo might require a bit more rotation on the volume dial to get to the volumes that you're used to with some of your other amps, but for all of the headphones that I've currently got here, except the Tungsten, that equated to about 40 to 50% on the volume dial, so you don't have to crank the volume on the Velo and stress it out. But where most amplifiers I'm running around about the 10 o'clock position, on the Velo I'm closer to 12 o'clock. There's actually no power output quoted on the Linear Tube Audio website for the Velo, and that might be because the tubes all have their different levels of output. I'm not entirely sure. Everything's quoted over there in decibels of gain as opposed to particular power outputs. All I cared about though when it came to trying out the Velo was whether it could drive the headphones and how good it sounded. And as I've already said, it sounded great and it could drive everything except those very, very difficult headphones. And so the Velo is going to be a great match with a Focal Clear, a Focal Utopia, a HEADPHONE AMPS Stealth or HE1000 SE, a Meza Elite or a Meza 109 Pro. They're all going to work fantastically with the Velo. However, if you're going to spend over $2,000 on an amplifier like the Velo, you're going to want to know how it stacks up to the competition, and things get a little bit trickier here. Switching over to the more expensive Linear Tube Audio MZ3, which retails for $3,700 with a linear power supply and the ability to drive speakers, the MZ3 was ready to go a little bit faster. And that was interesting to me. It doesn't really matter, but it was curious. I don't know if these amps use just a timer or if it's sensing voltage or temperature coming off the tubes, I'm not sure. But for whatever reason, despite being similar circuits, the MZ3 clicked to life before the Velo did. One challenge when comparing amplifiers like this is that they've all got slightly different tubes. The MZ3 came stock with a set of NOS Brimar 12AT7 equivalent tubes in the front, and a set of 12SN7 equivalents, once again a new old stock pair, in the back sockets. On the other hand, the Velo had a similar pair of 12AT7 variants up the front. They were NOS JJ tubes, and then up the back was a set of 6SN7 variants. As far as I can tell, all the tubes that Linear Tube Audio supply with these amps are new old stock, and that means that you're going to get a little bit of variance from one amp to the next. And as a quick side note here, living with the Velo has made me realise how much I like the open design. I do enjoy tinkering with tubes from time to time, and having the open design of the Velo where I can quickly pop out the tubes and try some others is actually a really appreciated change. I also think it looks really cool, but that's going to be very personal. Coming back around to the sound of these two amps though, and the MZ3 in its stock form is immediately a slightly more resolving sound. It's got a sense of having a bit more detail and clarity in the top end, whereas the Velo comes across just a little bit richer, a little bit smoother sounding. And that actually makes the Velo a little bit easier and more relaxing to listen to. Not that the MZ3 is hard to listen to, it's still a wonderful, engaging tube amp, but the Velo just has that little touch of tubey magic, you could say. After going back and forth quite a lot between these two, it became clear to me that the Velo is actually the one that I wanted to keep plugging back into. I was definitely hearing a little bit more sense of detail, texture, breath in vocals from the MZ3, there was no doubt about that. And so that made the MZ3 the more intellectually engaging amp, but I was more emotionally engaged by the Velo. To try to put these on a level playing field, I used the NOS Brimar CV4024 tubes from the MZ3 in both amps, and for the rear 6SN7 or 12SN7 sockets, I used a matched pair of Ray 6SN7 select tubes. Even with exactly the same tubes in both amps, it was still clear that the MZ3 was just resolving that little bit more detail still. It's the slightly more technically capable amplifier, but again, the Velo is the one that was engaging me more emotionally. The Velo is the one that is more like what people think of when they think of tube amps. On the other hand, the MZ3 is a bit more like a solid-state amp, but with the fluidity and the ease that only tubes can bring. If we start thinking about soundstage, everything's a little bit closer, a little bit more intimate on the Velo, and that might initially sound like a negative, but it actually had a positive as well, and that is that things like vocals and instrumental solos sounded more present, they sounded more tangible and tactile in space. Instruments come across a touch more resonant from the Velo versus more textural from the MZ3. However, the MZ3 does pull ahead once again in things like maximum size, depth, and layering in the soundstage. And so it's actually very hard to split these two. I like both for different reasons. My head wants to constantly listen to the MZ3, my heart wants to constantly listen to the Velo. And so realistically, both are fantastic. I think the MZ3 offers the higher ceiling. With the best possible choice of tubes, I think the MZ3 can be an even better amp than the Velo can ever be. But on the other hand, the Velo offers a much lower entry point if you don't need a speaker amp and if you want the more emotionally engaging amplifier right off the bat. But what if you're not hooked on it having to be a tube amp? I've only compared 2 linear tube audio products so far, and if you're spending $2,000 to $3,000 on a headphone amp and preamp, you might be looking at solid state too. And so I look towards the Burson Soloist 3X GT headphone amp, and the version that I've got set up here is equivalent to buying the Velo with the linear power supply, because the version of the GT that I've got here has got the power supply chips included and also the upgraded power supply. It's what's called the deluxe model if you were to buy it straight from the Burson website. The Burson Soloist 3X GT has way more power than the Velo, so we should get that out of the way straight away, but we should also remember that power is not everything. And indeed, as I compared the 6.3mm output from the Velo and the 6.3mm output from the Soloist 3X GT, because that was the plug on the end of the cable, as I compared the two, there was basically no difference between the technicalities of these amps. Both resolved about the same level of detail. However, if you've got the GT, you're probably going to run a balanced cable to it, and when you do that, it does pull ahead of the Velo. From the 4-pin XLR output of the Soloist GT, I was getting a greater sense of resolution and clarity or detail, and the soundstage also got a bit larger, particularly in terms of width. Having said that, the Velo was still the slightly more intimate amplifier, and again that's in rather a good way, and it was also the more easygoing and relaxing listen. It was clearly easier with the Soloist GT for me to mentally separate the sounds if I wanted to, but conversely, it was easier just to relax into the music and enjoy the music for the sake of the music in the case of the Velo. And so once again, I'd say that the Soloist GT is the amplifier you would choose with your head. The Velo is the amp you would choose with your heart. And while we're talking about heart, let's talk about what really floats my boat with the Velo. When you first look at the Velo, as I said before, it looks pretty simple and pretty basic, much like those seemingly unassuming people I mentioned earlier. But then you look a bit closer at the Velo and you start using it. You notice that the edges of the case are all subtly beveled, and that the top plate fits seamlessly into the outer frame. The placement of the screws around the top plate are accents in the design rather than just a structural necessity. And the space around the tube sockets hasn't been left open and gaping into the inner circuitry. Instead, there's a tasteful metal flange around each of the sockets. Now that's all aesthetic so far, but they're all really nice touches. And then we get to using the amp. Pressing the buttons on the amp reveals that they're solid metal with a lovely actuation. In other words, how they feel. The indicator lights are clear and bright, but they're a lovely warm light that's relaxing rather than cold and stark. When you turn the volume dial, there's a tiny optic symphony as all the LEDs brighten gradually to show you the level of the volume that you're currently up to. And they brighten and dim gradually as you're adjusting the volume before fading away and leaving just a single indicator light to show you where you've stopped. On top of that, the Velo is going to remember the volume level that you've selected for each input and each output. In other words, if you're on input 1 and maybe you're listening to your speakers using the Velo as a preamp, let's say you're at 60% of the volume. You then want to plug in your headphones and you're still on input 1. When you plug your headphones in, the Velo is going to remember that you were listening at only 40% with your headphones and it's going to drop back down to 40%. In other words, for input 1, input 2, input 3, it's going to remember the output levels for headphones and the output levels for preamps. So essentially it's got 6 different memories going on to make sure you never get a rude shock. And I think that's really, really cool. I'll admit that they're all small touches, but the combination of all of this makes every interaction with the Velo an absolute joy. When you use the Velo, you're connecting with a device that's got heart and soul, that's then connecting you to the music that you love. The Velo is kind of like an old friend that's reminding you of an album that you used to love, or introducing you to an album that you're going to love. And so in short, the Velo is an amp that to me is more about the love of music than it is about the pursuit of perfection. It's not quite as technical as the MZ3 or the Soloist GT, but it's more warm-blooded than either of them. For now, so long as the Velo is here with me, it's stolen a permanent place in my source chain as both a headphone amp and a preamp. And that's not because it's the best performing device that I've got here, although it is excellent. It's because it's the most enjoyable product that I've got to interact with. This is an amplifier for music lovers, pure and simple. If that sounds good to you, check out the link down below through to Linear Tube Audio, where you can learn more about the Velo. And as always, thank you to channel members, to Patreon members, and to those of you that leave super thanks here on YouTube. If you like the sound of what I've said about the Velo, but you want a more technical amplifier, then make sure you check out this video up here next, where I've reviewed the Linear Tube Audio MZ3. For now though, happy listening, be kind to each other, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.